On the coldest morning Iron Ridge Valley had ever recorded, a father stood in the middle of the town square and tried to sell his own grandchildren. He called it settling a debt. Every single person in that crowd watched it happen, hundreds of them, neighbors, churchgoers, men who had shaken hands with Eleanor's husband at his funeral not 4 months before. And not one of them moved. Not one of them spoke. Until a stranger with a scarred face, a wolf's coat, and apparently nothing left to lose pushed through that crowd and said four words that nobody in Iron Ridge Valley ever forgot. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now, drop your city in the comments below, and let me see how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to take a while. The first thing you need to understand about Eleanor Graves is that she was not a soft woman. She had never been soft. Not when her father dragged the family across 3 states chasing work that never materialized. Not when she married Thomas Graves at 19 in a ceremony with no flowers and a borrowed dress. Not when Thomas came home drunk 2 nights out of 5 and spent his morning staring at the floor with that hollow look she could never quite reach. She had survived things. Quietly. The way women on the frontier survived things. By keeping their mouths shut, their hands moving, and their eyes fixed on whatever small piece of the future they could still see clearly. But the winter of 1887 was testing something deeper than resilience. It was testing whether a person could bend indefinitely before they simply broke. The shack at the edge of the Mercer Road had never been built to last. Thomas had thrown it together during a hopeful summer when he still believed the land would yield something, that the cattle would multiply, that the soil would soften, that things would eventually turn. The walls were mismatched boards with gaps you could press a finger through. The roof sagged in 3 places. One wall had been patched with flattened tin cans, hammered flat, and nailed over a hole that opened up during the first hard freeze. Eleanor had stuffed rags into every crack she could find. It wasn't enough. Inside, 6 children slept in 2 beds pushed together near the stove, 12-year-old Caleb and 10-year-old Samuel sharing one end, 8-year-old Abigail wedged between 6-year-old Rose and 4-year-old Henry, with baby Clara swaddled in a flour sack against Eleanor's side of the mattress. They slept like that not for warmth alone, but because the far corner of the room had started to lean outward, and Eleanor had quietly moved everything away from that wall 2 weeks ago without telling the children why. She just said the stove heated better if they all stayed close. Caleb had looked at her in a way that told her he understood more than she wanted him to. He was 12, not stupid. He saw the wall. He saw the cold. He didn't say anything either. That was the kind of household they had become. Thomas Graves had been dead for 4 months and 3 weeks when the letter arrived. Eleanor had found him in the barn on an October morning, crumpled against the stall door with a look on his face she still couldn't fully describe. Not peaceful, not anguished, just done. Like a lamp that had simply run out of fuel. The official cause was heart failure, and maybe that was true in the most basic mechanical sense. But Eleanor had always suspected the real cause was something that couldn't be written on a piece of paper. Thomas had been a man carrying too much weight in too small a chest. She had loved him in the crooked, complicated way you love someone you chose before you fully understood yourself. He had never been cruel, not exactly, but he had been weak in ways that cost them both. And by the end, their marriage had become less a partnership and more 2 people surviving the same circumstances from separate rooms. She grieved him, she did. But grief and financial ruin arrived at the same time, and the latter was louder. The letter came 3 days after the funeral. It was from Victor Hale's attorney. Firm letterhead, clean, precise language. The kind of document that had been written by someone who got paid to make ugly things sound reasonable. Thomas, it explained, had borrowed against the land twice without telling her. He had borrowed from a private creditor, his own father, to the amount of $460, with interest. The land itself, it turned out, had never been fully in Thomas's name. Victor Hale had retained a partial claim on the deed going back years. A detail Thomas had apparently hidden from Eleanor with the same quiet shame he hid everything. $460 might as well have been $4,000. Eleanor had $11 in a tobacco tin above the stove. She wrote back asking for time. Victor didn't respond. His attorney did twice, with letters that grew shorter and colder each time. Then the letters stopped entirely. And then Victor Hale himself appeared, February 3rd, 1988. The temperature had dropped to something the older settlers said they hadn't felt in 30 years. The kind of cold that made the air feel solid, like breathing through wet cloth, except the cloth was frozen. Eleanor heard the horses first. She was at the stove trying to coax heat out of a fire that kept wanting to die, one hand bouncing Clara against her shoulder, the other feeding in the last of the split wood. She heard the horses, then the creak of wagon wheels on frozen ground, then voices. More than one, more than two, and something in her stomach clenched tight and did not let go. She set Clara down in the flour sack cradle and went to the window. Victor Hale's black wagon sat in the yard. Behind it, two deputies on horseback. Behind them, a man in a city coat she didn't recognize, tall, thin, carrying a leather satchel that looked clean and expensive and out of place against the gray winter sky. Victor himself was already climbing down from the wagon. I was 61 years old and built like something that had been designed specifically to not be moved. Wide through the shoulders, thick in the neck, with a white mustache kept so neat it looked like a statement. He wore a heavy wool coat and good boots, and an expression Eleanor had always privately thought of as his business face. Not angry, not warm, simply certain. The face of a man who had already decided how things were going to go. "Children," Eleanor said quietly. Not a yell, just enough. "Get your coats on." Abigail looked up from the corner where she'd been reading, or pretending to, Eleanor could never tell which, and studied her mother's face with that careful, serious way she had. Then she set the book down and stood up without a word and started helping Henry with his buttons. Caleb appeared in the doorway from the back room, already holding Samuel's coat. He had heard the horses too. Good boy, Eleanor thought. She took one breath, then she opened the door. The walk into town was a quarter-mile on a packed dirt road turned solid as iron. Eleanor didn't know why Victor had told them to follow his wagon into town rather than conducting whatever business he intended at the house. She had a dark suspicion that had to do with witnesses, that he wanted an audience, that this had been calculated, that whatever was about to happen was meant to be seen. She was right. By the time she reached the edge of the town square, with her 6 children strung out behind her in a line, Caleb with Clara wrapped against his chest, Samuel gripping Abigail's hand, Eleanor carrying Henry on her hip, the square was already crowded. It was a Saturday. Market day, or what passed for it in February. A few merchants, a few farmers, men who had no particular business but had come anyway because word traveled fast in a small valley, and something in the air that morning had the particular quality of an event about to happen. They were all there. The blacksmith, the preacher, the widow Forsyth who ran the dry goods counter, old Pete Callahan who had been Thomas's friend, or claimed to have been, the schoolteacher, Miss Darnell, still in her good coat from morning services. They all watched Eleanor walk across the square. Nobody came forward to stand beside her. Victor waited in the center of the square beside a wooden crate that had been placed there deliberately, like a podium, like a stage. His attorney stood just behind his left shoulder with the satchel open. The 2 deputies flanked them at a respectful distance. Victor looked at Eleanor the way you look at a problem you've already solved. "Eleanor," he said. His voice was calm and carried easily in the cold air. "I've given you 4 months. I want you to know I considered that a generous accommodation." "You gave me nothing." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "You gave your attorney paper." Something moved behind his eyes. Irritation, quickly suppressed. He didn't like being interrupted. Thomas had told her that once, in one of his rare unguarded moments. The old man can't stand to be interrupted. She had filed that detail away without knowing when she'd ever use it. "The debt is legal and documented," Victor said. "The deed claim is legal and documented. And your circumstances," he glanced at the children with an expression she could only describe as assessment, "are such that you cannot satisfy either obligation." "Tell me what you're actually proposing," she said. "In plain language, since we have an audience." He had the grace, at least, to look briefly uncomfortable. Then, "The older boys, Caleb and Samuel, have been arranged with the Hartley farm north of town. They're short 2 hands, and the Hartleys are willing to take them as working laborers against a portion of what's owed. The arrangement would run through their 18th year. Eleanor didn't speak. Her grip on Henry's coat tightened until her knuckles ached. "Rose and Abigail," Victor continued, "have been arranged with Mrs. Colburn in the valley. Domestic placement. They'd be housed, fed, and educated in basic skills. Again, against the debt." "And Henry and Clara?" Her voice was quiet, dangerously quiet. "Family placement. The Hendersons have agreed to take both young ones. They've been wanting children for years." He said it like it was a kindness, like she should be grateful. The square was absolutely silent. Eleanor stood still for a moment. Just a moment. The kind of stillness that happens right before something gives way entirely. She could feel it in her own chest, some last structural wall of composure trembling at its foundation. Henry had his face pressed into her neck. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the weight of them. He could feel it in how she was holding him. "You are not taking my children," she said. "Eleanor, you are not taking my children." Victor's expression hardened. "This isn't a negotiation. The documents are drawn and witnessed. The arrangements have already been agreed upon by all parties. This is a legal settlement of a lawful debt, and nothing you say in this square changes. I'll pay the debt." The voice came from the back of the crowd, low, even, carrying no particular urgency, which somehow made it more arresting than a shout. The crowd shifted. People turned. A path opened. Not quickly, not with dramatic intention, just the natural parting that happens when someone is moving through and radiates the quiet certainty that they will not be stopping. The man who stepped through wore a coat made from wolf pelts, badly stitched in places, the kind of thing you made yourself over several winters from animals you'd killed yourself. He was not especially tall, but he was wide through the chest in a way that suggested not bulk, but use, a body that had been put to actual work for a long time. His face was deeply weathered, the left side marked by a scar that ran from just below the eye to the jawline. Old, white, long-heeled, but permanent. He wore a hat that had seen better seasons and boots that were practical and nothing else. I was perhaps 35, perhaps older. The mountains had a way of making that hard to calculate. He stopped about 10 feet from Victor Hale and looked at him with no particular hostility and no particular warmth. "Every cent," the man said. "Gold. Today." Victor stared at him. "And who in the hell are you?" "Gideon Cross. I run the Cross Ranch up past the Blackstone Pass." He said it matter-of-factly, like he was telling someone the time. "I know what the debt is. 460 plus interest since October. Figure that's somewhere around 510 at current rate." He glanced at the attorney. "That close?" The attorney blinked. $512. "I'll have it to you by end of day." The silence in the square had changed quality. A moment ago, it had been the silence of people watching something they didn't dare interrupt. Now it was the silence of people trying to figure out what they were watching. Victor Hale's jaw tightened. "The arrangements have already been made, Cross. This isn't— You said it was a debt settlement." Gideon's voice remained steady. "Debt gets settled, the rest falls apart. That's how a legal debt works. Your own attorney will tell you." Victor looked at the attorney. The attorney's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "He's technically correct. If the debt is fully satisfied, the basis for the arrangements— I know what my options are," Victor said, very quietly and very cold. "Then you know what my option is," Gideon said. They stood looking at each other for a long moment. The whole square held its breath. Then Victor looked at Eleanor. His eyes moved over her and the children with an expression she had never been able to name. Not hate, exactly. Not love. Something older and uglier than either. Something proprietary. "This isn't finished," he said. "It is today," Gideon replied. Eleanor did not cry in the square. She had made herself a rule about that years ago, about where and when tears were permitted. And she held to it even with her knees wanting to buckle, and Henry's weight on her hip and Abigail's small hand finding hers in the press of the crowd, as people started to move and talk all at once around them. She found Caleb first. He was still holding Clara, his face very still and much older than 12. Watching Gideon cross the square toward Victor's attorney with a kind of focused calm that probably scared Eleanor more than tears would have. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her. "You holding her all right?" "Yes, ma'am." "Okay." That was all she said. It was all either of them needed. She approached Gideon Cross an hour later, outside the assay office where he'd apparently had gold waiting, which meant this had not been impulsive, which meant he'd known, which meant something she hadn't sorted out yet. "I need to ask you something," she said. He was folding a receipt the attorney had signed and putting it in his coat pocket. He looked up. "Why?" she asked. I was quiet for a moment. Not evasive. Thinking, she thought. Actually considering the answer rather than reaching for something polished. "I needed extra hands for the spring drive," he said finally. "Figured you had enough of them." She studied his face. The scar. The eyes, which were gray and tired in a way that had nothing to do with today. "That's not the whole answer," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then, almost quietly, No, it's not. He didn't offer the rest. And for reasons she couldn't entirely explain, she didn't push for it. What happens now? She asked instead. I've got a ranch, he said. 6-room house, give or take. Room for all of you. You'd have to make the drive up before the next storm. I'd say 2 days at the outside. He paused. I'm not asking for anything in return. I want to be clear about that. People will talk. People already are, he said, with what she thought might have been the faint outline of a dry smile. That horse has left the barn. She looked at her children gathered at the edge of the boardwalk. Samuel with his arm around Rose. Abigail watching Gideon cross with the particular focused intensity she reserved for things she was trying to understand. Henry, sitting on an overturned crate, eating the heel of bread someone in the crowd had pressed into his hand. 6 children. February. An empty shack with a wall about to give way. 2 days, Eleanor said. 2 days, Gideon agreed. The drive north took most of the first day and half of the second. The road past the Blackstone Pass was not a road so much as a general agreement between travelers about which direction to head when the valley floor gave out and the mountain started. In February, it was a white silence broken only by wind, the creak of the borrowed wagon, and Henry's periodic announcements about things he saw in the snowbanks that Eleanor was fairly sure weren't there. Gideon drove. Eleanor sat beside him. The children arranged themselves in the wagon bed between what remained of their possessions: 2 trunks, a tin box of documents, Abigail's 3 books wrapped in a shirt, the skillet Eleanor had refused to leave behind, and a crate with the remaining 2 chickens who had, against all reason, survived the winter so far. Nobody talked much. Eleanor spent the first hour waiting for something to go wrong, for the mask to slip, for the terms to change, for some version of this to reveal itself as one trap being exchanged for another. She had not survived 32 years on the frontier by assuming men's stated intentions were their actual ones. But Gideon Cross drove and said nothing and made no demands and did not look at her the way she had been looked at by men who wanted something. He looked, if she was being honest, like a man who was also waiting for something to go wrong. The Cross Ranch appeared as they came around the last bend in the mountain road, low and sprawling against the base of the rock face, built in timber and stone with a long covered porch running the front length, smoke rising from 2 chimneys, a barn set back and to the left, big enough for serious winter stabling, fences that were maintained, a woodpile that was substantial and properly stacked. Henry sat up straight in the wagon bed. Is that a house? He asked. Yes, Gideon said. A whole one? Far as I know. Henry considered this. It's big, he said, with a 4-year-old's complete directness. It's quiet, Gideon said. Could stand to be less quiet. He said it plainly, looking at the road ahead. Eleanor filed that away with everything else she didn't yet know about Gideon Cross. What had made that house so quiet, and whether whatever it was still lived there, and what exactly it was going to mean for all of them when spring came and Victor Hale remembered that he had said this isn't finished. She didn't know yet, but she was still alive. Her children were behind her, intact and breathing. That was what she had. For tonight, it was enough. The first morning at the Cross Ranch, Eleanor woke before anyone else and lay still for a full minute trying to remember where she was. The ceiling was timber, solid, not sagging. The window beside the bed held a rectangle of pale gray light, pre-dawn, mountain dark, the kind of darkness that had weight to it. The room smelled of pine resin and old wood smoke and something faintly like leather. Not unpleasant, just unfamiliar, which her body had decided to treat as a threat even in sleep. She sat up carefully, one hand finding Clara in the cradle Gideon had produced from somewhere in the back of the house the night before. An old thing, worn smooth, with a small chip out of one of the runners that someone had never gotten around to fixing. Clara was breathing. Rose was asleep in the trundle beside the main bed. In the room across the narrow hall, she could hear Samuel's unmistakable snore, which had driven Caleb to distraction since Samuel was about 3 years old. Everyone was here. Everyone was accounted for. She sat with that knowledge for a moment the way you sit with something fragile, making sure of it. Then she got up and went to find the kitchen. Gideon was already there. I was sitting at the long wooden table with a mug of something and a piece of paper covered in numbers that he folded and set aside when she appeared in the doorway. He looked like a man who hadn't slept much either, though he wore it differently than exhaustion. More like someone who was accustomed to the hours between midnight and dawn being their own. Coffee's on, he said. Thank you. She found a mug on the shelf. The shelves were organized, she noticed, in a blunt, functional way. Nothing decorative, just things placed where they'd be found quickly, and poured from the pot on the stove. The stove itself was a good one, cast iron, well-maintained, the kind of equipment that told you something about the person who used it. She sat down at the table. Not next to him, but not at the far end either. Somewhere in the middle, which felt honest. For a while, neither of them said anything. The fire in the stove ticked. Outside, wind moved across the mountain in long, slow waves she could hear through the walls but not feel, which meant the walls were actually solid, which still surprised some part of her that had spent 4 months living inside something held together mostly by determination and cold. "The boys," Gideon said finally. "Caleb and Samuel. If they're willing, I could use them starting with the morning feeding. Not hard work yet, just learning the routine. Horses first, then the cattle in the east pasture. I'll ask them. I'm not—" He paused, choosing the word carefully. "I'm not drafting them, if they'd rather not." "I'll ask them," she said again. "Caleb will want to. Samuel will do what Caleb does." Something at the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Older brother effect. Something like that. She wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the table. There was a ring stain in the wood near the edge. Old, permanent, the kind left by years of the same mug being set down in the same spot. She thought about the person who had left it there. Gideon had mentioned, the night before, directing them to rooms, that the house had been built for more than one person. He'd said it without elaboration, and she hadn't asked, and the silence around the subject had the particular shape of something that didn't want to be touched yet. "There are things we should probably discuss," she said, "practically speaking." "There are. Victor isn't going to let this sit." "I know." "He said it wasn't finished." She looked up. "He meant it. Victor Hale has never said a thing he didn't mean, including the terrible things." Gideon turned his mug slowly on the table. "I figured." "So what's your plan?" I was quiet long enough that she thought he might not have one, which would have been honest but also alarming. Then, "Stay put. Let him make the first move. He'll try something legal. That's his style. He doesn't dirty his own hands if he can find a way around it." He looked at her. "What do you know about the deed situation?" "Exactly. Thomas told me the land was ours. He lied, or he believed what his father told him, which amounts to the same thing." She kept her voice flat. "Victor had retained a partial claim going back to when Thomas first started the farm. I never saw the original documents. I didn't know to ask." Did Thomas know? She thought about that. About the hollow look Thomas sometimes got staring at the floor. About the way he'd refused, over the years, to discuss his father in anything but the most surface terms. About the loan she hadn't known about until a lawyer's letter arrived 3 days after the funeral. "I think he knew something was wrong," she said. "I don't think he knew the exact shape of it." Gideon nodded slowly. "Victor gave him just enough information to keep him dependent. That's a particular kind of control. He said it without heat, just observation, like someone who recognized the mechanism." Eleanor looked at him. "You know Victor Hale." "I know men like Victor Hale." A pause. "And I know what they do when someone takes something they consider theirs." The word theirs landed between them, and neither of them addressed it directly. But Eleanor heard it. She understood he wasn't talking about land. "He'll come back," she said. "Yes," Gideon said, "he will." The coffee had gone slightly cold by then, and the window had started to lighten at its edges, and somewhere in the house Henry was making the specific kind of noise that meant he'd woken up confused and was about 30 seconds from escalating. Eleanor stood, set her mug in the basin, and went to get him. That was the first morning. It was not the worst, and it was not the best. It was simply the first, which mattered more than either. The days that followed had a shape to them that Eleanor hadn't expected. She had anticipated friction, the grinding adjustment of 6 children in an unfamiliar space with an unfamiliar man, the resentments that would build, the rules that would clash, the 100 small daily ways that living with someone reveals the parts of them they don't show in public. There was friction. She'd be lying to pretend there wasn't. Caleb took to the ranch work with a focus that bordered on grim, arriving at the barn each morning before Gideon asked, and putting in hours without complaint. But he also flinched the first time Gideon raised his voice. Not at any of them, just outward, at a horse that wouldn't settle. And Eleanor saw it happen and filed it away as one of the debts Thomas had left behind that she hadn't known to count. Samuel was 11 and loud and had opinions about everything and was not remotely interested in filtering any of them. On his third day, he informed Gideon during the morning feeding that the way Gideon organized the hay storage was inefficient and he had a better system. Gideon had looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Show me." Samuel had shown him. Gideon had implemented it without comment the following morning. Samuel had been following Gideon around like a satellite ever since, which Eleanor was fairly sure Gideon found exhausting, but which he bore with a patience that surprised her. Rose was 6 and shy, and had attached herself to the ranch's single surviving barn cat with an intensity that seemed to satisfy something in both of them. She didn't talk much, she never had, but she started eating at the second week, really eating, not the careful rationing that Eleanor had watched her do all winter, and that mattered more than words. Henry was 4 and broke 2 things in the first week, both by accident, and cried both times with such complete sincerity that it was difficult to stay irritated. The second thing he broke was a clay jar on the kitchen shelf that had contained buttons. It slipped from his hands when he was trying, unsolicited, to help Eleanor organize the pantry, and the buttons scattered across the entire kitchen floor and into every possible crevice and corner, and Henry stood in the middle of it crying, and Gideon, who had come in for a water break, looked at the floor and then at Henry, and then said, very quietly, "We'll find them. Go get the broom." He spent 20 minutes on his knees with a 4-year-old finding buttons. Eleanor had watched from the doorway without either of them noticing her. She didn't know what to do with that yet. Clara was 8 months old and largely indifferent to the upheaval, as infants mercifully are, and she slept and woke and demanded food and slept again, and the only development of note was that sometime in the third week, she grabbed Gideon's thumb during a breakfast Clara had no business being present for and refused to let go. And Gideon had sat there with his thumb in an infant's fist, reading Samuel's questions about cattle weights with a stillness that looked, from the outside, like a man being very careful not to disturb something. And then there was Abigail. Abigail was 8 years old and the most observant person in the house, including the adults. And she had been watching Gideon cross since the moment he stepped through the crowd in the town square with the careful, measuring attention she gave to things that she hadn't decided about yet. She didn't follow him like Samuel. She didn't flinch like Caleb. She watched. She caught Eleanor alone one evening near the end of the second week, in that window between the younger children going down and the older ones coming in from evening chores, sitting beside her at the kitchen table with the deliberate casualness that meant she had something to say. "He had a family," Abigail said. Eleanor looked at her. "What makes you say that?" "There's a room at the end of the hall." She said it simply, not sneakily. She wasn't reporting a transgression, just a fact. "The door was open when the wind came through yesterday. There's a small bed in there, not like ours, smaller, and a trunk with a painted flower on it. The paint is old." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "You didn't go in," she said. It wasn't a question. "No." Abigail picked at the edge of the table. "I just saw it." "Some things aren't ours to ask about yet," Eleanor said carefully. Abigail thought about this. "Did he lose them the way we lost Papa?" "I don't know. Maybe." "Is that why he helped us?" Eleanor set down the cloth she'd been holding. "Abigail, I genuinely do not know. And I'm not sure it matters in terms of what we do with the help once it's given." Abigail considered that with the focused expression of someone running calculations. "I think it matters for knowing whether to trust him," she said. "Because if he lost people and it broke him the wrong way, then it matters. But if it broke him the right way—" She paused, searching for words. "Some people get mean when they lose things, and some people get careful." Eleanor looked at her daughter for a long moment. "When did you get so old?" she asked. "I was always this old," Abigail said, and got up to set the table. It was Caleb who found out first. Not by asking, not by snooping, just by being in the wrong place at the right moment, as 12-year-olds sometimes are. He came back from the barn one evening in the third week with a look on his face that Eleanor recognized as the particular expression he wore when he'd witnessed something he was processing. He sat through dinner quietly, which was not unusual, but after the younger ones were settled, he found Eleanor in the kitchen and stood in the doorway with his arms crossed in a way that mirrored, she realized with a small jolt, exactly how Thomas used to stand when he had something difficult to say. "He had a daughter," Caleb said, "and a wife. There was a man in town today, the one with the red barn 2 miles down the road. He came by to check on some fence business. He didn't know I was in the loft. He asked Gideon how long it had been since the fever came through. Gideon said, 3 years. Eleanor stopped what she was doing. 3 years, she said. Yes, ma'am. Caleb uncrossed his arms. He didn't say any more than that. And then the other man said something like, That's too long to keep living up here alone, Gideon. And Gideon said, Probably. And that was it. The kitchen was quiet. Caleb, Eleanor said, Don't tell the others. Not yet. I wasn't going to. He paused. Is he going to be all right? Having all of us here, I mean, with the noise and everything. She looked at her oldest son, 12 years old and already worrying about the emotional architecture of a grown man he'd met 2 weeks ago. I don't know, she said honestly, but I think we should try to be decent about it. Caleb nodded. Then he went to bed. Eleanor stood at the basin for a long time after that, washing the same dish she'd already washed, thinking about a man who had spent 3 years alone in a house with a small painted trunk at the end of the hall and a ring stain in the wood where he set his coffee mug every morning in the same spot, and who had, without apparent forethought, walked into a town square on the coldest February morning in 30 years and spent $512 in gold to keep 6 strangers together. She didn't have a clean explanation for it. She had learned, over 32 years, to be suspicious of things she couldn't explain. But she had also learned that the absence of explanation was not the same as the presence of danger. The distinction mattered. She was still trying to decide what to do with it when the letter arrived. It came on a Thursday in the 3rd week, carried up the mountain by a rider from town who handed it over with an expression that suggested he'd been told it was urgent and was personally relieved to be done with it. Eleanor was in the yard with Henry when it came. She recognized Victor's attorney's letterhead from 50 feet away. She handed Henry to Rose, who was nearby with the cat, and opened it standing in the yard in the cold. It was 4 pages. By the time she'd read the 2nd page, her hands had stopped being quite steady. She found Gideon in the barn, doing something complicated with a piece of harness that required both hands and most of his attention. He looked up when she came in. He read her face. Sit down, he said, even though there was nowhere particularly comfortable to sit. He said it the way someone says it when they mean stop standing up before you don't have to anymore. She sat on a hay bale and handed him the letter. He read it with the stillness of someone who had been expecting it, and was now simply measuring the exact shape of what they'd been expecting. His expression didn't change much, a slight tightening around the jaw, a long breath through the nose. He's filing for custody, she said, because she needed to say it out loud. He is. He's claiming I'm unfit. He's claiming the children are in an unsafe environment. He's claiming... She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. He's claiming that the arrangement here is improper, and that I have demonstrated a pattern of neglecting their welfare. Her voice stayed controlled through most of it. It cracked slightly on neglecting. Gideon set the letter down on the workbench beside him. That won't stand, he said. You don't know that. Victor has the town's judge in his pocket. Everyone knows it. He has the better attorney, he has the money, and he has a very clean story that makes him the concerned grandfather and me the failed mother who sold herself to a stranger to keep from losing her land. She looked at him. That's the story he's going to tell. That's the frame he's going to put around all of this. Then we change the frame. How? She wasn't being combative. She genuinely wanted to know. Gideon was quiet for a moment, turning something over in his mind. Then, we'd have to get married. The hay bale was not comfortable. The barn was cold. Outside, one of the horses shifted and stamped and then was quiet. Married, she said flatly. On paper. He said it immediately, clearly. Legal protection makes it harder for him to claim impropriety. Makes you a household rather than a loose arrangement he can call anything he wants in front of a judge. He kept his eyes on her steadily. I'm not asking for anything beyond that. I want to be clear about that in plain language, not just in implication. Paper marriage. You and the children would have legal standing under my name and your household would be a recognized unit, that's all. Eleanor looked at him for a long time. She thought about all the ways a man could say one thing and mean another. She thought about Thomas, who had meant well and lied anyway, and about Victor, who had never meant well and never pretended otherwise, and about all the men she had watched operate in the world between those 2 poles. Then she looked at this man, sitting on a workhorse with a half-mended harness in his hands, and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to perform anything, and she thought, He is not lying to me right now. She didn't know why she was sure. She just was. What if Victor challenges the marriage itself? She asked. Claims it was arranged to circumvent the lawsuit? Then we deal with that. You make it sound simple. It isn't simple, he said. But the alternative is letting him win by default. And I don't think you're willing to do that. A long silence. No, she said quietly. I'm not. She stood up and took the letter back from the workbench and folded it along its original lines with the precise movements of someone keeping themselves composed by focusing on small physical things. I'll need to think about how to explain this to the children, she said. Yes, Caleb especially. He understands more than he lets on. I know. She turned to go, then stopped. Gideon. She said his name for the first time directly, and it felt like something clicking into a different position. The room at the end of the hall. She felt him go still behind her. I'm not asking you about it, she said without turning around. I just want you to know that I know it's there, and that we're going to be careful with it. A very long silence. Okay, he said. His voice was slightly different when he said it. Not broken, just lower. She walked back out into the cold yard where Henry was sitting in the dirt explaining something earnest and incomprehensible to Rose's cat, and she let herself think for exactly 1 minute about how utterly impossible all of this was. Then she went inside and started figuring out how to survive it. The wedding, such as it was, happened 8 days later in the county clerk's office in Iron Ridge, with the clerk as witness, and Samuel as the self-appointed second witness, despite the fact that his presence was neither required nor initially invited. He had simply appeared, in his good shirt, when the wagon was leaving, and when Eleanor looked at him, he said, I thought someone should come, with the absolute conviction of an 11-year-old who had decided the matter was settled. Gideon had looked at Eleanor. Eleanor had looked at Samuel. Then she'd moved over on the wagon bench and made room. The ceremony was less than 5 minutes. The clerk was a small man named Dodgson, who read the words from a card and looked faintly uncomfortable, possibly because the bride and groom were standing at precisely the distance people stand when they don't know each other well and are being honest about it. When it was over, Dodgson said, You may, and then thought better of it. Thank you, Gideon said, and signed the paper. Eleanor signed beside him. Samuel, from the chair against the wall, gave a single satisfied nod, like a man completing an item on a list. On the drive back up the mountain, nobody spoke much. The snow had softened overnight and the road was better than it had been. The mountains to the north were clear, the Blackstone Pass visible all the way to the high ridge line, everything white and enormous and utterly indifferent to the small wagon making its way underneath. Samuel sat between them on the bench, eating a biscuit he'd somehow acquired in town, looking at the mountain. Are you going to have a different last name now? He asked Eleanor. I suppose technically. And are we? He meant him and the others. Eleanor thought about that for a moment. That's up to you, each of you, when you're ready to think about it. Samuel chewed his biscuit. I think Henry will want to, he said. He won't really remember having a different one. Nobody said anything for a while after that. The wagon moved through the white silence of the mountain road. Gideon kept his eyes on the path ahead, but his jaw had shifted slightly, like a man holding something in that he hadn't expected to need to hold. Eleanor saw it. She didn't say anything. Some things didn't need words yet, and she had learned, slowly and at some cost, to tell the difference between silence that was emptiness and silence that was just something waiting to be ready. The ranch appeared around the last bend. Smoke from both chimneys. Caleb's figure visible at the fence line, doing the late afternoon check Gideon had shown him. Rose in the yard with the cat. Abigail in the window looking out, and when she saw the wagon coming, she stepped back from the glass in the particular way of someone who had been watching for it. The house was not quiet anymore. It was a long way from what any of them had imagined it would be. But there was smoke in both chimneys, and there were 6 children and a half-mended harness in the barn, and a paper marriage and a very large problem still moving toward them from the valley below. And tomorrow, Victor Hale's attorney would be filing papers in a courthouse where the judge had been eating at Victor's table for 15 years. Eleanor climbed down from the wagon and went inside to start dinner, because there was nothing else to do. And because the children would be hungry, and because some battles had to be fought first from the kitchen and then from the courtroom, and she had always been better at the former than she'd been given credit for. The latter, she was going to have to learn. The trial date came down in writing on a Tuesday in late March, delivered by the same writer who had brought Victor's first letter, except this time Eleanor was expecting it, and had the particular stillness of someone who has been bracing for impact long enough that the impact itself almost comes as a relief. April 14th, Iron Ridge County Courthouse, the Honorable Judge Aldous Prentice presiding. Gideon read the summons at the kitchen table that evening and set it down without comment. Eleanor watched him read it. She had gotten reasonably good, in 2 months of living in close quarters with this man, at reading the things his face didn't say out loud. Prentice, she said. I know. He's been Victor's man since before Thomas was born. Victor put the money up for his campaign the first time he ran. Everyone in the valley knows it. I know that too. Then you know what that means for us walking into that courtroom. Gideon turned the paper over on the table, which was not quite the same as putting it away, but accomplished something similar. It means we can't win on procedure. We can't win on technicalities. If Prentice is inclined to rule for Victor, he'll find a way to make the law fit that ruling. He looked at her. So we have to make it so that ruling costs him too much. We have to make the truth in that courtroom so plain and so witnessed that even a bought judge has to think twice about what he puts his name on. How? By telling it straight, everything, no polish, no performance. He paused. Victor's attorney is going to try to make you look like a woman who failed her children. The only answer to that is the actual story, which means you can't hide the hard parts. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. In the other room, she could hear Rose trying to teach Henry a card game with rules that were clearly being invented in real time, and Henry's periodic protests when the rules changed in ways that disadvantaged him. The hard parts, she said. Yes, including Thomas, including whatever's relevant. He kept his voice careful. I'm not asking you to air things that don't matter, but if Victor's going to claim you're an unfit mother, then the full picture of what you were working against, the debt, the lies, the conditions, all of that has to be on the table. She stood and went to the window. The yard was blue-gray in the early evening, the mountains behind it going dark from the top down. She had been looking at those mountains for 2 months, and they still didn't feel like hers. She wondered if they ever would, or if that was the wrong way to think about it entirely. He's going to bring up the marriage, she said. He'll claim it was arranged specifically to manipulate the custody outcome. Probably. Is he wrong? Gideon was quiet for a beat. It was arranged to protect the children. Whether that's manipulation depends on who's telling the story. She turned around. And your past. He'll find out about your wife and daughter. Something in the room changed quality, the way a room changes when a window opens in winter. Not violent, just suddenly different. Yes, Gideon said, he will. And he'll use it. He'll find some way to use it against you. She said it not unkindly, just directly. He'll say you're damaged, unstable, that you've brought a woman and 6 children into an environment shaped by grief. He might. Are you prepared for that? Gideon looked at the table for a moment. There were scratch marks in the wood near the edge. Old ones, small, the kind left by a child with something sharp. And Eleanor had noticed them weeks ago and quietly not asked about them. He was looking at them now. I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not in front of a judge, he said finally. I spent 3 years after the fever trying to become less than I was, smaller, quieter. I thought that was how you survived it. You just reduced yourself until the grief had less to work with. He stopped. It doesn't work that way. I'm not going to walk into a courtroom and show them a performance of a man who's got everything sorted. I'll tell them what's true. It was the most he had said about it, directly, in 2 months. Eleanor came back to the table and sat down. Okay, she said. Okay. Then we need an attorney. The problem was money, because it was always money. Gideon had enough put by for the ranch to run through the summer and into fall, but $512 in gold in February had not left a large cushion, and a good attorney, a real one, not someone who handled fence disputes and bill collection, would cost considerably more than they had available to spend. It was Caleb who solved it, in the indirect and accidental way that Caleb solved things, by mentioning, at dinner, that the man at the feed store in town had been asking after Gideon by name. Old man with a gray beard and a city coat, Caleb said, not looking up from his plate. Told me to tell you that Harlan Marsh sends his regards. Gideon put down his fork. You know him, Eleanor said. I knew him, years ago. He picked his fork back up. I'll ride down tomorrow. Harlan Marsh turned out to be a 63-year-old attorney who had retired to Iron Ridge Valley 4 years earlier following a legal career in the territorial courts that had, by his own account, aged him considerably faster than he deserved. He was a compact man with intelligent eyes, and the particular manner of someone who had spent so long listening to people lie in formal settings that he developed an involuntary flinch response to anything that didn't ring true. He had apparently known Gideon Cross's father. The nature of that connection was not discussed. Some things between men of a certain age and history don't require discussion. What was discussed, over coffee, in Marsh's tidy parlor, while a small fire burned low in the grate, was the case. Marsh listened without interrupting. He took no notes. He just listened, with his hands folded on his knee and his head slightly tilted, which Eleanor came to understand was how he organized information, not on paper, but in the architecture of his own attention. When they'd finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Victor Hale's attorney is Cornelius Webb," he said, "from Cheyenne. I've seen Webb work. He's precise, he's methodical, and he's extremely good at making reasonable-sounding people look unreasonable in front of a jury." He looked at Eleanor. "He will not attack you loudly. He'll do it quietly. Small questions, reasonable tone, designed to accumulate. By the end of his examination, you'll feel as though you agreed to things you never agreed to." "What do we do about that?" Eleanor asked. "You don't agree to the premise of the question, ever. If he asks you whether you struggled to provide for your children, the answer isn't yes or no. The answer is the full truth of what the circumstances were that created that struggle. Don't let him isolate facts from their context. That's his entire method." Marsh looked at Gideon. "And you're going to be the easier target, which means you're also the more important witness. Webb will try to paint you as a violent isolate who purchased a family for improper purposes. He'll bring up your history." "I know," Gideon said. "He'll make the grief look like instability. He'll make the marriage look like predation." Marsh let that sit for a moment. "How do you respond to that?" "By telling the truth about what it was." Marsh studied him. "Even the ugly parts?" "Because the truth about a man who spent 3 years alone in the mountains after losing his family is not uniformly flattering. It's going to include things that sound, taken out of context, exactly like what Webb will claim they are." Gideon didn't flinch. "I said tell the truth, not a good version of it." Marsh was quiet for another moment. Then something in his expression shifted, not warmth exactly, just a particular quality of recognition. "All right," he said, "let's get to work." The 6 weeks between that meeting and the trial were the strangest of Eleanor's life, and her life had not been short on strange. The ranch kept running. Animals still needed feeding. Fences still needed tending. Henry still broke things and cried about them. Rose's cat had, against everyone's expectations, produced 4 kittens in the hay of the barn, and this event consumed approximately 40% of the household's emotional bandwidth for 2 full weeks. Life did not pause to accommodate the approaching trial, which Eleanor found both maddening and, on reflection, probably merciful. But underneath everything was the knowledge that it was coming. She drilled with Marsh twice a week, Gideon riding down to collect her, the two of them going over testimony in Marsh's parlor, while Gideon sat in the corner and listened and occasionally offered a correction when she summarized something in a way that softened it more than the truth warranted. She hated those corrections even when they were right, which they usually were. "You said Thomas struggled with money," Gideon said one afternoon, 3 weeks before the trial. "He did. He secretly borrowed $460 from his own father, using the land as collateral, and didn't tell you. That's not the same as struggled with money. Don't soften it. He's my children's father. He's still their father, whether you say the true thing or the soft thing, but the true thing is what's going to protect them in court." She looked at him for a long moment across Marsh's parlor. He looked back, steady and direct, and not unkind, just unwilling to pretend. "Fine," she said, and said the true thing. Abigail had been told she might be called as a witness. Eleanor had tried to have this conversation gently, with appropriate preparation, and Abigail had listened to the entire explanation with her careful, watchful expression, and then asked only one question. "Will my grandfather be in the room?" "Yes," Abigail had nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. "You don't have to." "I want to," Abigail said with a quietness that was not the quietness of passivity, but of something that had been decided and was finished, being deliberated. "I've wanted to say things for a long time. About him." She looked at Eleanor. "About what he did. About things I saw and things I know." Eleanor felt something cold move through her. What things, Abigail? What Abigail told her then took 20 minutes, spoken in a low, even voice, without tears. Not because she wasn't affected, but because she had apparently been carrying it long enough that the telling of it had become something she could manage. She told Eleanor about things she had seen at Victor's house, during the one visit they'd made after Thomas's funeral. Things Eleanor hadn't been present for, had not known to ask about. The way Victor had spoken to Thomas's younger brother. The locked door. The sound behind it. And something else. Something about a night, years earlier, that Abigail had been told was a dream and was not a dream. By the time Abigail finished, Eleanor's hands were flat on her knees and her jaw ached from being held still. Does anyone else know? She asked. No? Abigail paused. I didn't know if anyone would believe me. I believe you, Eleanor said immediately. Abigail looked at her mother with an expression that was too old for 8 years old. I know, she said. That's why I told you. Eleanor found Gideon in the barn that evening and told him what Abigail had said. He stood absolutely still through all of it. When she finished, he turned away and put both hands on the fence rail and stood there for a moment with his back to her, doing something with his breathing. She wants to testify, Eleanor said. She's 8 years old. I know. Webb will come after her. I know that too. Gideon turned back around. His face was controlled, but barely. We let her decide. It's her testimony. Her truth. He stopped. But I need Marsh to prepare her better than he's prepared anyone. I want every trick Webb has, every way he'll try to twist a child's words, and I want Abigail to know them all before she walks in that door. Eleanor nodded. And Eleanor? His voice had gone quieter. Is there anything else? Anything you know about Victor, about things he did? Anything you've been holding back because it was too hard to say? She had been holding something back. She had been holding it back for years. In the way you hold something that has no clean container, you just carry it and you never put it down, but you also never hand it to anyone because there's no good way to explain the weight of it without reliving the full moment. She had been alone with Victor once, 3 years into her marriage. Thomas had been away for 4 days on cattle business. Victor had come to the house with paperwork, or said he had. What had happened in the next 20 minutes had never been spoken of afterward, and Victor had looked at her across the table the following Sunday with a calm certainty that told her he knew she wouldn't tell, and he knew why, and he had filed the knowledge of her silence away as a tool he owned, she told Gideon. She watched his face as she told him. She watched the particular stillness that came over him, the kind of stillness that wasn't control but the outer edge of something that needed very hard management. When she was done, he said nothing for a moment. Then, Marsh needs to know. I know. Are you able to say it again, in a courtroom? She had asked herself the same question for 2 days. I don't know, but I think I have to try. You don't have to, he said. That's a choice. The choice is what protects my children. She said it plainly. So yes, I have to. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his face she hadn't quite seen there before. Not pity, nothing as simple as pity. Something older and more complicated, the recognition one person carries when they understand, from the inside, what it costs to say a true thing out loud in front of people who will use it however serves them. I'll be there, he said, the whole time. It wasn't a grand gesture. He said it the way someone states a simple practical fact. But she felt the weight of it settle differently than she expected, somewhere lower and more steady than her chest. The morning of April 14th arrived with thin, cold clouds and a wind coming off the mountains that smelled like snow that hadn't fallen yet. The courthouse in Iron Ridge was a 2-story timber building with a single courtroom on the upper floor that normally held perhaps 80 people. By the time Eleanor and Gideon arrived with Marsh at 8:30, the street outside was already lined with horses and wagons. The whole valley had come. Eleanor saw faces she recognized, people from the town square in February, people who had stood and watched and said nothing, while Victor's attorney read the arrangement aloud. They were here now, filling the benches and the standing room along the walls, speaking in low voices that cut off in sections as Eleanor walked up the courthouse steps. She kept her eyes forward. She kept her hands still. Caleb was back at the ranch with the younger children. Only Samuel and Abigail had come, both in their cleanest clothes, Samuel sitting very straight and very still in the second row with an expression of concentrated fury that Eleanor hoped he'd be able to hold in check, and Abigail beside him with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes finding Eleanor's briefly across the room. Not afraid, not performing bravery, just steady. Victor Hale sat at the plaintiff's table with Cornelius Webb and two associates and a leather-bound case of documents. He wore his best suit. He had the bearing of a man who had been in rooms like this before and found them accommodating. He did not look at Eleanor when she came in. That told her something. Judge Prentice entered at 9 o'clock sharp, a tall, thin man in his late 50s with a face that gave very little away, and the careful, measured movements of someone who was accustomed to the performance of authority. Eleanor watched him settle into his chair and arrange his papers. She looked for something in his face that would tell her which way this was going to go. She couldn't read him. That was either good or terrible. Webb opened the plaintiff's case with the measured, pleasant tone Marsh had warned her about. A reasonable man, explaining a reasonable concern, presenting himself to the court as nothing more than a person who cared about the welfare of children. He laid out Victor's claim in clean, careful language. A grandfather, deeply worried. A mother in financial ruin. An arrangement with a man of questionable history and isolationist tendencies. Children in an environment that had not been assessed, verified, or approved by any relevant authority. The question before this court, Webb said, looking at Judge Prentice with the expression of a man delivering a conclusion he found personally painful, is not whether Mrs. Graves loves her children. We have no doubt that she does. The question is whether love alone is sufficient foundation for custody, or whether these children deserve stability, resources, and the guidance of family who can reliably provide for their futures. He said family as though Victor Hale and the word were natural partners. Marsh rose when it was his turn, and he did not match Webb's pleasantness. He didn't try to perform warmth or gravitas. He just spoke plainly and directed Eleanor to do the same, and she did. She walked through the winter, the debt, the auction in the square, the conditions her children had survived, and the 2 months at the Cross Ranch with the direct, unadorned honesty of someone who had decided that polish was a liability and the truth was the only thing she had enough of. Webb cross-examined her for an hour and 17 minutes. I was as good as Marsh had said. He was patient and methodical, and he asked each question twice, slightly differently, looking for the place where her answer would shift enough to suggest inconsistency. He pressed on Thomas's character, on the state of the shack at the edge of Mercer Road, on the speed of the marriage, on the nature of her relationship with Gideon Cross before the ceremony. He asked whether she had ever, in the course of that winter, left her children unsupervised for any period of time. He asked about Clara's weight at birth and whether she had received any medical attention in the months following. He asked about the book Abigail had been reading on the day of the square and whether she had purchased it or if it had belonged to the household before Eleanor's arrival. It was the button detail that told Eleanor he had done thorough research on their household. She didn't know who had talked. It didn't matter. She answered every question with the full context, not the isolated fact. She didn't get flustered. She got, if anything, quieter. And the quieter she got, the more the courtroom leaned in, and the more Webb's patient pleasantness began to look, around the edges, like something working too hard. Then Gideon took the stand. Webb let him sit for a moment before beginning. It was a calculated pause, the kind designed to let an audience's assumptions about a large, scarred man fill the silence before he had a chance to fill it himself. "Mr. Cross," Webb said, "you spent approximately 3 years living alone on your mountain ranch before the arrival of Mrs. Graves and her children. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And during that period you had," a small pause, a slight tilt of the head, "minimal contact with the broader community." "Some contact, not much." "Would you characterize yourself as a sociable man?" "No." "You had a previous family, a wife and daughter." The courtroom was very still. "Yes," Gideon said. "And they passed away, approximately 3 years ago." "Yes." "From fever." "Yes." "And following that loss," Webb continued, in the same careful, measured tone, "you withdrew from community life, conducted no social relationships, maintained no correspondence with neighbors or civic bodies, and by all available accounts became, for a period of years, a man who existed outside the normal structures of society." He looked at the judge. "I don't say that unkindly, Mr. Cross. I say it because this court must understand the condition, the emotional and psychological condition, of the man into whose care Mrs. Graves has placed her 6 children." Marsh started to rise. Gideon spoke before he reached his feet. "That's mostly accurate," Gideon said. His voice was even. "I was in bad shape for a while. I won't argue that. I didn't see people much. I didn't want to. When you lose your child, your capacity for being around other people's children is... He stopped briefly, and the pause was not performance, just the actual moment of a man running up against the true weight of a sentence. It goes somewhere. For a while. Webb had not expected him to agree. It had thrown off the rhythm of the method. But you've had those children in your home for 2 months now, Gideon continued, not quite stepping on Webb's next question, but arriving at his own answer before it could be asked. And I'll tell this court what I told the only person who asked me plainly. They're safe in my house. They eat, they sleep, they learn. The older boys do real work and they do it well. The little ones have more than they had, which was close to nothing. He looked briefly at Judge Prentice. I know what it looks like from the outside. A strange arrangement, a fast marriage, a man with history, nobody's told you straight. But what's happening in that house is that 6 children who are about to be separated and sold off as labor and domestic servants are instead growing up together, in one place, under one roof, with their mother. He stopped. That's the whole story. I don't have a better version of it. It was not eloquent in the formal sense. It had no rhetorical architecture. But something in the courtroom shifted when he said it. A collective exhale, almost inaudible, the sound of 80 people deciding something. Webb recovered. He moved on. He pressed the marriage again, the speed of it, the convenience. He pressed Gideon on the financial arrangement, on the gold payment, on whether any prior relationship with Eleanor had existed before that February morning. No, Gideon said. I didn't know her. And yet you paid over $500 for her children's freedom. For her family's freedom, Gideon said, with the first flash of something harder in his voice. There's a difference. Is there? In practical terms? Yes, in every term. Webb looked at him for a moment with an expression that contained a small recalculation. Then he excused the witness. Then Marsh called Abigail. The courtroom went genuinely quiet when she came through the door. Not the trained silence of people watching a proceeding, but the involuntary hush of a room adjusting to something it hadn't quite prepared for. She was 8 years old and small for it, in a dark blue dress Eleanor had mended the night before, and she walked to the witness chair and sat in it and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the judge with the expression of someone who had decided exactly what they were going to do and was now simply doing it. Webb did not underestimate her. Eleanor gave him that, reluctantly. He did not make the error of condescension. He came at her gently and precisely, trying to establish that she was too young to fully understand what she'd observed, that her impressions might be colored by loyalty to her mother, that children in frightening circumstances often constructed memories to explain feelings they didn't have other language for. Abigail listened to each question in its entirety. Then she answered. You've asked me if I'm sure about what I saw, she said, in the middle of Webb's 4th attempt to introduce doubt. And I've told you I'm sure 3 times. I don't know what else to say to that. Webb tried a different angle. Your grandfather, your mother's father-in-law, he visited your home in the period following your father's death, didn't he? He came once, to the shack. Yes. And he seemed concerned about your welfare at that time. Abigail looked at Victor Hale. Victor Hale looked back at her. He had the expression of a man who had calculated that a child of 8 would not say the hard thing in front of a room full of strangers. He had the certainty of someone who had always been able to rely on that calculation. Abigail looked at Victor Hale for a long, steady moment. Then she turned to the judge, and she began to speak. She said what she had seen. She said what she had heard. She said what had happened on the night she'd been told was a dream. She said it without crying and without flourish. And with the terrible, precise clarity of a child who has been holding something for a long time and has finally found the room big enough to put it down in. The courtroom did not make a sound. Victor Hale's face changed in a way that Eleanor had never seen it change before. Not anger. Something underneath anger. The look of a man watching a wall he had counted on for years discover it could fall. And for the first time in Eleanor's memory, Victor Hale looked afraid. Webb had no further questions. The recess that Judge Prentice called immediately following Abigail's testimony lasted 45 minutes, which was 35 minutes longer than any recess the Iron Ridge courthouse had seen in living memory. Eleanor sat in the hallway outside the courtroom on a bench worn smooth by years of people waiting for things they couldn't control. Abigail sat beside her with her head against Eleanor's arm, not crying, not talking, just present in the particular way of someone who has spent everything they had and is now simply resting inside the aftermath. Samuel was at the far end of the bench with his elbows on his knees and his hands locked together, staring at the floor with an expression Eleanor recognized as the Graves family face for an emotion too large to be named directly. Gideon stood at the end of the hall near the window. He had not sat down since Abigail came off the stand. He was looking out at the street below where more people had arrived. Word had traveled fast, the way it always did in a valley this size, and there were now horses and wagons lining both sides of the road for half a block in either direction. Marsh appeared from around the corner at a pace that was not quite a run, but contained the energy of one. Webb just went into chambers, he said, low and directed at Gideon first, then Eleanor. Requested a private conference with Prentice. Can he do that? Eleanor asked. He can request. Whether Prentice grants it is another question. Marsh sat down on the bench across from them and set his case on his knee. His face had the focused, slightly bright expression of a man who had seen a situation tilt and was trying to measure exactly how far. What Abigail said in there, Prentice heard it, the room heard it. You cannot unhear testimony like that. Webb knows it. So what does Webb do now? Gideon asked, still at the window. He tries to limit the damage. He'll argue that a child's account is inherently unreliable, that the emotional conditions of the trial have compromised her objectivity. He has a playbook for this. He's used it before. Marsh paused. But the problem for him is that Abigail wasn't emotional. She was precise. There's a significant difference between a crying child and a composed one in terms of how a judge receives it. Eleanor looked down at Abigail, who appeared to have gone to sleep against her arm, or something close to it, the limp, released weight of a body that had been holding tension for hours. What about Victor? She asked quietly. Marsh was careful. Victor's position has changed in the last hour. Whether he knows that yet is another question. He knows, Gideon said from the window. He's known for 30 seconds, the moment she started talking. I watched his face. Nobody said anything for a moment. There's something else, Eleanor said. She had been sitting with this since the morning, since before they'd come into the courtroom, since she'd made the decision 3 days ago, and had not gone back on it, and was not going to go back on it now. I need to testify again. Marsh, I need to go back on the stand. Marsh looked at her carefully. We discussed what that involves. I know what it involves. Webb will cross-examine. He'll be aggressive this time. He had you once and you held steady, but this, what you're proposing to tell them, that gives him material he's going to press hard on. He'll question your timing, your motivation, why you didn't report it at the time, why you stayed. I know, she said. I know all of that. Marsh was quiet for a moment. Is there any part of you that wants to protect what you've already built today? Because what Abigail gave this court is significant. It may be enough. Eleanor looked down the hallway. The doors of the courtroom were still closed. Behind them, Victor Hale was sitting at his table with his attorney and his associates and his leather-bound case of documents and his 61 years of certainty that the world arranged itself according to his preference. No, she said. It's not enough. Not for me. Marsh looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded, once, and opened his case and began writing on a pad. Gideon had turned from the window at some point during this exchange and was watching Eleanor with a stillness she had come to understand as his version of something he couldn't say directly. She met his eyes briefly. He gave a small nod that meant whatever it meant. I hear you, I'm here, it's your call. All of those things compressed into a gesture that took half a second and communicated everything relevant. She nodded back. When the recess ended and the courtroom refilled, the quality of the silence inside was different than it had been that morning. The morning silence had been anticipation. This was something heavier. The silence of a room that had already witnessed something and was now waiting to find out what it meant. Webb did not get the private conference with Prentice. The judge had declined it, which itself was a signal, though Eleanor was careful not to read too much into signals from a man whose allegiances she still couldn't fully trust. Marsh stood and requested that Eleanor be recalled to the stand. Webb objected on technical grounds that Marsh dismantled in 2 sentences. Prentice sustained Marsh's position without comment and directed Eleanor to take the stand. She walked to the chair and sat down and faced the courtroom. She had asked herself the night before whether she was doing this for the right reasons, whether it was about protecting her children or about something older and less clean, about the 20 minutes in that house 3 years ago and the look on Victor's face afterward, and the years of silence that had followed, her silence, maintained not out of weakness, but out of the particular calculation that women on the frontier made about which truths were survivable and which were not. She had decided it was both, that both could be true at once, that the thing which protected her children and the thing which finally refused to be silent were the same act, and that was all right. Marsh led her through the preliminary questions and she answered them, and then he asked her, plainly and directly, whether there was anything else relevant to Victor Hale's character and conduct that the court should hear. She looked at Judge Prentice. She did not look at Victor. 3 years ago, she said, in the late fall, my husband Thomas was away for 4 days on cattle business. Victor Hale came to our house. He said he had paperwork for Thomas. She kept her voice level. She had rehearsed this enough times that the shaking was somewhere below the words rather than in them. Thomas wasn't there. I told him that. He came inside anyway. The courtroom was absolutely silent. She told it, all of it, in plain language, with specific detail, without apology, and without excess. She told it the way you tell the thing you have carried alone for years when you have finally decided that the carrying of it serves no one, least of all, yourself. When she finished, the room stayed silent for several seconds longer than rooms usually stayed silent. Then someone in the gallery made a sound, not a word, just a sound, the involuntary kind, and it broke the seal and the room became very loud all at once, until Prentice brought his gavel down twice, sharply. Eleanor sat still through all of it. She felt, from the corner of her eye, Gideon's presence at the defense table. The stillness of him, absolute controlled. The stillness of a man managing something with both hands that could not be set down in a courtroom. She did not look at him directly. She kept her eyes forward. Victor Hale had gone the color of old candle tallow. Webb stood for his cross-examination with the bearing of a man carrying an unexpected weight and trying not to show it. He pressed her on timing, as Marsh had predicted. He pressed on motivation. He asked, with studied neutrality, why a woman who had experienced what she described had continued to live within a reasonable distance of the man responsible, had continued to bring her children to Sunday dinners, had continued to maintain civil contact for years afterward. Because I had 6 children, Eleanor said, and no money, and a husband who was complicated about his father in ways I couldn't fix, and because I made the calculation that silence was survivable and speaking was not. She looked at Webb directly. I was wrong about that. But I understand why I made it, and I think most people in this room do too. Webb did not have a clean answer for that. He tried one more angle, suggesting that the account was conveniently timed, that it had emerged only once Victor had initiated legal proceedings, that the sequence of events invited skepticism about its origin. He's been in this courtroom for 2 days, Eleanor said. He's heard everything that's been said. He has not denied a single thing my daughter testified to. He has not denied the debt, the arrangement in the square, the legal manipulation. He has not denied any of it. She paused. If I were fabricating, this would have been the moment to deny. He hasn't. Webb glanced at his table. Victor was staring at the surface in front of him with the expression of a man who had retreated to somewhere interior and was not entirely available. No further questions, Webb said. It was not a concession exactly, but it sounded like the edge of one. The remainder of the afternoon was occupied with procedural elements. Marsh presenting documentation of the household's conditions, letters from the man with the red barn 2 miles down the mountain who had known Gideon Cross for years and was apparently willing to put that knowledge on paper, receipts showing the children's medical visits in town since February, Caleb's school enrollment paperwork that Gideon had arranged without being asked. Small things, factual things, the unglamorous connective tissue of a life being built rather than merely claimed. Victor's side presented their remaining witnesses, a woman named Mrs. Colburn, who had been one of the intended placement households, and who spoke about the suitability of her home with the defensive energy of someone who knew her role in the original arrangement did not reflect well on her, and one of Victor's ranch hands, who testified to Gideon's general isolation and temperament in terms so neutral they barely supported the case being made. Webb made his closing argument in 20 minutes. It was good. It was probably the best argument available to him, given the day he'd just had, focused heavily on procedural legitimacy and the value of established family structure and the court's responsibility to ensure stability. He did not revisit anything Abigail or Eleanor had said. He moved around those things the way you move around furniture in a dark room, carefully, by memory, hoping not to knock anything over. Marsh's closing was 11 minutes. He did not try to match Webb's legal architecture. He said plainly that the court had heard 2 days of testimony, and that the picture it produced was not complicated. A woman had kept her children alive through an impossible winter, with no help from the man now claiming to act in those children's interests. A stranger had offered what the family could not provide themselves. The household established at the Cross Ranch was, by every observable measure, functional, stable, and improving. The alternatives proposed by the plaintiff would have separated 6 siblings, placed the oldest boys in conditions indistinguishable from indentured labor, and removed the youngest 2 from their mother permanently. "This court has the opportunity," Marsh said, looking at Prentice with the directness of a man who had nothing left to perform, "to put its name on the right side of what happened in this valley, this winter. That opportunity doesn't come around as often as it should. I would encourage the court to take it." Prentice called for deliberation and recessed for the evening. Eleanor and Gideon walked out of the courthouse at 5:15 into the late afternoon light, which was thin and gold and coming at a low angle across the valley floor. The crowd outside had not entirely dispersed. People were standing in groups along the road, talking in low voices, looking at them as they came down the steps. Nobody moved to speak to them immediately. The valley was still working out what it thought. Eleanor found Samuel at the bottom of the steps and put her arm around his shoulders and felt him tense briefly, and then relax against her side. He was 11 and trying to be older, and had been trying since the morning with the fierce, slightly desperate determination of a boy who understood the stakes and had decided not to break under them. "Is it over?" he asked. "Not until tomorrow," she said, "when the judge comes back." "But we did everything right?" She thought about that honestly. "We did everything we could. I don't know if it's the same thing." Samuel absorbed that. "Gideon was good," he said, with the tone of someone filing a verdict. "In there. He was good." "He was," she agreed. They stayed in town that night at the boarding house, which felt strange after 2 months of the mountain's quiet. The walls thinner, the sounds of the street coming through in layers, other people's conversations and horses, and the distant sound of the saloon operating at its usual Thursday evening capacity. Abigail slept immediately, which Eleanor was grateful for. Samuel stayed awake longer. She could tell by his breathing, but he didn't say anything and eventually went under. Eleanor lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the town and thought about Prentice. She had watched him through 2 days of testimony. She had tried to read him and found him largely unreadable, which was either the result of genuine judicial temperament or a practiced neutrality that concealed a predetermined outcome. Marsh had said, when she pushed him on it that evening over the boarding house's thin supper, that he thought Prentice was genuinely uncertain, that the shape of the day had moved something in the man, but that he would be spending tonight weighing what that movement was going to cost him against what ruling the other way had just become. "Victor still has influence in this valley," Marsh had said carefully. "Prentice knows that. But Prentice also knows that the room heard what it heard today, and that rooms talk. Whatever he decides, he's going to have to live with it publicly." "Is that enough?" Eleanor had asked. Marsh had looked at his coffee. "I hope so," he said, which was honest, and which was the most frightening answer he could have given. She slept in pieces. She woke twice, once from a sound in the street that turned out to be nothing, once from a dream she couldn't hold on to, but which left her with the echo of the shack at the edge of Mercer Road, the leaning wall, the stove that never quite got warm enough. She was awake before first light, sitting at the window of the small room with her knees drawn up, watching the sky lighten incrementally over the eastern ridge. She heard a door open down the hall. Footsteps that she recognized, the particular cadence of someone moving quietly because others are sleeping, but who is not themselves at rest. A pause outside her door. Then, low, "Eleanor." She got up and opened it. Gideon was in the hallway in his boots and coat, clearly not having slept in any conventional sense. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment in the thin gray light of the boarding house corridor. "I keep going back to Prentice," she said, because it was what was actually on her mind, and she had stopped having the energy to approach things indirectly. "So do I." "What do you think he does?" Gideon leaned against the wall. He looked like a man who had turned a question over enough times that he'd gotten past the question to something underneath it. "I think he's a man who has spent 15 years making small accommodations," he said, "letting things go, looking the other way because the cost of looking directly was too high, and I think yesterday was the first time in 15 years that the cost of looking the other way got higher than the cost of looking directly." He paused. "I think he'll do the right thing." Not because he's a good man, because it's become more expensive not to. Eleanor considered that. That's a bleak way to trust someone. It's the honest way. He met her eyes. But I've been wrong before. She almost smiled, not quite, but close. That's not comforting. I know. The verdict came at 9:47 in the morning. The courtroom was, if anything, more crowded than the day before. The news had gone out overnight with the particular velocity of small valley information, and people who had not been present for the testimony had come for the verdict with the expression of those who felt, obscurely, that their presence was a kind of participation in something that mattered. Prentice entered without ceremony, and sat and arranged his papers with the same measured precision he had shown throughout, and Eleanor thought, watching him, that whatever was about to come out of his mouth, he had decided it completely and was at peace with having decided it. The question was just which way the piece ran. He read the ruling without preamble. The plaintiff's petition for custody was denied on all counts. The court found no evidence of unfitness on the part of Eleanor Graves, found the household at the Cross Ranch to constitute a stable and functional domestic environment, and found the plaintiff's characterization of said environment to be unsupported by the testimony presented. The room erupted. Prentice brought his gavel down, twice, 3 times, and the noise subsided but did not disappear. It compressed itself, became a current running under the room's surface rather than above it. He continued reading. The court, he said, had concerns about the plaintiff's conduct as represented by testimony received during these proceedings. Those concerns were being referred to the territorial authority in writing, and the court was recommending that an investigation be opened. He said it in the careful, formal language of a judge being precise, but underneath the precision was the unmistakable shape of a man putting distance between himself and a long association. Victor Hale did not move during any of this. He sat with the stillness of a man whose internal infrastructure was undergoing something significant that he was not going to allow to be visible. Webb leaned and said something quietly, and Victor gave no response. Prentice set down the ruling and looked at the room. "This proceeding is closed," he said. "We're adjourned." The gavel came down once more, final and clean, and then the room came apart at its seams. Voices, movement, people turning to one another in the benches, the particular sound of a crowd that has just watched something they expected to go one way go another. Eleanor sat with her hands flat on the table in front of her and did not quite move. She heard Marsh say something beside her. She heard Samuel make a sound that was probably a laugh and probably something else at the same time. She heard the general roar of the room, and then she felt Gideon's hand cover hers on the table, not dramatically, not with any particular meaning she could attach to a word, just present and steady. And she turned it palm up, briefly, and then they both took their hands back because the room was watching and there were things that did not need to happen in front of 80 people. But it had happened. It had been there. She got up and found Abigail first. She had been in the second row with Samuel, and Eleanor crossed to her and crouched down and looked at her daughter's face, and Abigail looked back with the expression she always had after she'd done something difficult. Not proud, not relieved, just finished. The particular piece of someone who carried a thing to its destination and put it down. "You okay?" Eleanor asked. "Yes," Abigail said, and then quietly, "Is he going to go away now?" Eleanor thought about that honestly. "He's going to have to answer for things," she said. "Whether that means away." She stopped. "I think the valley's done with him. I think that matters." Abigail considered this. "I think it matters too," she said. Victor Hale left the courthouse on his own, which itself told a story. Webb was gathering his papers with the brisk efficiency of a man who had another case in another county and had already moved forward. The 2 associates had vanished. The deputies who had flanked Victor in the square in February were nowhere in evidence. He walked out into the street alone in his good suit and his careful boots, and Eleanor watched him from the top of the courthouse steps without saying anything. The crowd in the street parted for him, but not in the old way, not with the deference of people who recognize power and accommodate it reflexively. They parted the way people part for something they've decided they're done with, the way they step back from a fire that's gone out. Victor felt it. She could see that he felt it. In the set of his shoulders, in the particular way a man carries his body when the ground beneath a lifetime of certainty has shifted in some foundational way. He did not look back. He got into his wagon, alone, no driver, and turned it south and drove out of Iron Ridge Valley. And the people in the street watched him go and did not call after him. and did not wave and did not speak his name. Eleanor stood at the top of those steps for a long moment. She thought about Thomas, about what Thomas had carried all those years and been unable to put down, about the weight of a father like that on a man who was already struggling to hold himself together, about the hollow look that she had never been able to reach. She had been angry at Thomas for a long time, for the debt, for the secrets, for the dependence he'd never managed to break. And she was still angry, some of it, in the complicated way you stay angry at someone you've also loved. But standing there watching his father's wagon disappear down the valley road, she felt the anger soften around its edges into something more like sorrow. Thomas had been fighting something she hadn't known the full shape of. He had lost. She had been fighting a version of the same thing. She had not lost. Marsh appeared at her elbow, pulling on his coat. Territorial authority will take 6 to 8 weeks to acknowledge the referral. Could be longer. Victor has connections there too, though fewer than he has here. He looked at her sideways. But the referral is on record. His name is on a territorial document now in connection with an official inquiry. That changes his position in ways that are difficult to reverse. Will anything actually happen to him? She asked. Marsh was quiet for a moment. I don't know. Power doesn't collapse all at once, usually. It erodes. He paused. What I can tell you is that this valley is going to remember what happened in the last 2 days for a very long time. And that Victor Hale will have to live inside that memory every time he comes to town, every time he sits down with a business associate, every time someone mentions Iron Ridge in his presence. He picked up his case. For a man like Victor, that's a particular kind of consequence. He shook Gideon's hand and nodded to Eleanor and said he'd be in touch about the paperwork, and then he walked down the steps, and the crowd absorbed him. Eleanor turned to Gideon. I was looking at the road where Victor's wagon had gone, with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not satisfaction, not quite. Something more tired than that, and something underneath the tiredness that was perhaps the beginning of relief, though it was the kind of relief that takes a while to arrive because the emergency has been going on so long that the body doesn't trust the silence yet. We should get back, he said. Caleb's been alone up there since yesterday. Yes, the kids are going to want to know. Samuel's going to tell them before we get the wagon out of town, she said. Something near his mouth moved. Probably. She looked at him in the full morning light, the scar, the tired eyes, the coat that had seen too many winters. The man who had spent $512 in gold on strangers and called it a practical decision about ranch hands. Thank you, she said. Not for the money, not for the court, not for any specific thing, just for the accumulation of it. For all the mornings and the harness work and the buttons on the floor and the hand on the table and the specific quality of being a person who meant what they said. He looked at her for a moment. I know, he said, which was not a conventional response and was also somehow exactly right. They collected the children and walked down to where the wagon was tied. Samuel was already talking, his voice carrying ahead of them, explaining something to Abigail with emphatic gestures that suggested he was taking a certain editorial liberty with the sequence of events. Abigail was listening with patient skepticism. Henry, who had been with a neighboring family for the day and had been collected by Samuel that morning, was eating something and was pleased about it. The mountain road was long and the wagon was slow, and the afternoon would be cold before they reached home. But the children were here, all counted, all intact, and they were going home. That was still true. It was going to stay true. And Eleanor Cross, she was Eleanor Cross now, on paper at least, whatever that meant in every other sense, held that fact in both hands the way you hold something you thought you were going to lose, and you feel the shape of it, and you don't put it down. The drive back up the mountain took longer than usual because Samuel would not stop talking. He had appointed himself the official narrator of the day's events, and he delivered his account to Abigail with the authority of a war correspondent who had personally turned the tide of battle, which was not entirely inaccurate, but was heavily embellished in the sections involving his own reactions. Abigail listened with the expression she reserved for things that were partially true and did not bother correcting the exaggerations, which was its own form of generosity. Henry fell asleep against the side of the wagon bed somewhere around the 2nd mile, his face slack and trusting in the way only very young children sleep, completely, without reservation, as though the world had promised to hold still, and they believed it. Eleanor watched the mountains come back around them as the road climbed. The valley fell away below, and Iron Ridge with it, the courthouse, the boarding house, the street where Victor Hale's wagon had turned south and disappeared. all of it shrinking to the scale of a thing that had happened rather than a thing that was happening, and she felt the shift in her chest, the particular way a crisis recedes when it's over, not cleanly but in stages, like a tide that takes several hours to fully go out. She was aware of Gideon beside her on the bench. The distance between them was the same as it had been on every drive they'd made. Practical, unremarkable, the distance of two people sharing a seat without discussion. But something in it felt different this evening, and she didn't examine it directly because she had learned that some things arrived on their own schedule, and examining them too early just made them retreat. They reached the ranch as the last of the light was leaving the sky. Caleb was at the fence line, exactly where Eleanor had expected him to be, not waiting at the door, which would have required acknowledging that he had been worried, but outside doing something with the fence that probably didn't need doing, in a position that gave him a clear view of the road. When he saw the wagon, he straightened and watched them come in with the careful expression of a boy who wanted information, but was not going to ask for it with any urgency that might be interpreted as fear. Eleanor climbed down before the wagon had fully stopped. "It's done," she said. "We won." Caleb stood there for a moment. Something moved across his face. Not relief exactly, because relief requires the active presence of fear, and Caleb had been operating at a level of managed control for so long that his face had nearly forgotten how to show the things underneath. But it moved. It moved, and he looked away, briefly, at the mountain, and then back at her, and she walked to him and put her arms around him and felt him go rigid for half a second the way he always did. 12-year-old boys and their complicated relationship with being held. And then he didn't. He just stood there and let her hold him and didn't say anything for a long moment. "Okay," he said finally, into her shoulder. His voice was thick, and he cleared it immediately. "Okay," she agreed, and let him go, and neither of them mentioned it again. That night at dinner, all 6 children around the long table, which still felt slightly miraculous every time Eleanor counted the faces. Samuel delivered his full account of the trial in the same embellished correspondent style, except this time he had a larger audience and the performance expanded accordingly. Rose listened with wide eyes. Henry listened with his mouth open in the specific way he had when information was arriving faster than he could process it. Clara, who was 10 months old and mostly interested in the piece of bread she'd been given to occupy herself, periodically interrupted with opinions that were unintelligible but delivered with great conviction. Gideon sat at the end of the table and ate and listened and said very little, which was his standard condition at dinner. But Eleanor noticed he was watching the children with the specific quality of attention that she had come to recognize over 2 months. Not detached, not separate, just careful. The way someone watches a thing they're afraid to want too directly, in case the wanting changes it. Abigail noticed it too. She always noticed. After the younger ones were down and Caleb and Samuel had retreated to their room with the slightly forced casualness of boys who were going to talk about the day in private on their own terms, Eleanor found herself in the kitchen with the last of the dishes and the comfortable sound of the house settling into sleep around her. The fire had gone low. The mountains outside were invisible in the dark. Gideon came in for the water bucket and set it down and then didn't leave immediately, which was its own kind of statement. "Can I ask you something?" Eleanor said, not looking up from the basin. "Yes." "The day in the square. You said you needed ranch hands." She paused. "What was the real answer? You said at the time it wasn't the whole thing." He was quiet long enough that she turned around. I was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, not defensively but thoughtfully, looking at a point somewhere between the floor and the middle distance. She had asked this once before, 2 months ago, outside the assay office, and he hadn't given her the full answer then. She wasn't sure if she'd get it now. Some things in this man arrived slowly, by way of long internal roads, and pushing them didn't help. "I saw you in that square," he said finally, "before you saw me. I'd come to town for supplies, and I saw the crowd gathering, and I moved toward it because that's what you do, and I saw you standing there with your children behind you." He stopped. "And I saw the way you were standing." "What do you mean?" "You were terrified," he said, "and you were not going to show it. Not to him, not to the crowd, not to your children. You were standing there looking like a woman who had already decided she would not break in front of these people even if it killed her." He looked at her directly. "I recognized it, that's all. I recognized exactly what that was and what it cost, and He paused again, searching for the word. "I couldn't stand the idea of watching one more person get broken by something that didn't have to happen." The kitchen was very quiet. "One more person," she said softly. He met her eyes. "Yes." She turned back to the basin. Her hands were still in the water. She thought about a man who had spent 3 years in a house that was too quiet, managing his grief by reducing himself until there was less surface for it to work on, and who had walked into a town square on the coldest morning in 30 years and found, in a stranger's particular way of standing, a reason to stop reducing. She didn't know what to do with that yet, but she held it carefully. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "You asked," he said simply, and picked up the water bucket and went out to the barn to check the latch, which he did every night before bed, a habit so ingrained it had become part of the house's rhythm. She listened to the door close behind him. She stood at the basin for a while longer, in the low light of the kitchen fire, and she thought about Thomas, and about Victor, and about the shack at the edge of the Mercer Road with its leaning wall and its rags in the cracks, and she thought about the room at the end of the hall with the small painted trunk that no one had entered and no one had been asked to enter. She thought about Gideon's wife and daughter, whose names she didn't know yet, and about the fact that she didn't know them yet, and what it implied about the shape of whatever this was becoming. She wasn't ready to name it. That was all right. Some things didn't need names before they were real. Spring came to the Blackstone Mountains the way it always did at that altitude, reluctantly, in fits and starts, with several false attempts and at least 2 hard freezes after everyone had decided it was safe to believe. The snow retreated up the slopes in patches rather than all at once, leaving the lower fields mud-brown and then, slowly, the uncertain green of new grass that hadn't decided yet whether it was committed. The children expanded into the season like plants that had been waiting for light. Caleb turned 13 in April and received, from Gideon, the responsibility of the East Pasture's morning check on his own. No supervision, just the job. He took it with the gravity of someone who understood that the gift was not the task, but the trust. He never once failed to do it. Even on the morning of his birthday, when Eleanor had made a cake with the last of the sugar, and everyone stayed inside longer than usual, Caleb came down at first light, ate quickly, and went out. When he came back in, he was covered in mud from a fence post that had finally given up, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "Post 7 is down. I'll need help with the replacement," to Gideon. And Gideon said, "After breakfast." And Caleb said, "Yes, sir." And that was probably the moment Eleanor understood that something permanent had happened, though she filed it under things not to examine too directly. Samuel remained Samuel, loud, opinionated, relentless in his pursuit of an argument he found interesting, and genuinely gifted with the cattle in a way that had more to do with patience than anyone who knew him indoors would have predicted. He and Gideon had developed a working relationship that operated on the basis of Samuel proposing inefficiencies he had identified, and Gideon implementing approximately 40% of them after testing. The other 60% were rejected with a single sentence of reasoning that Samuel was permitted to dispute once, after which the matter was closed. Samuel found this arrangement deeply satisfying, which said something about what he had actually been looking for all along. Rose came into herself that spring with a quietness that was different from the winter's quietness. The winter's had been the quiet of a child conserving resources, and this was the quiet of a child who simply lived interiorly and had found an exterior that finally matched it. She read everything in the house she could find. She helped with the kitchen garden with a concentration that bordered on the religious. She named all 4 of the barn kittens after things no one else understood the reference to, and defended the names against all challenges with serene implacability. Henry turned 5 in June, and it was clear by then that he was going to be exactly the kind of person who made everyone's life significantly more complicated and significantly more alive simultaneously. He asked questions at a rate that could not be sustained by any single adult without rotation. He had strong opinions about fairness that did not always account for practical constraints. He was also, at unexpected moments, startlingly tender. The child who noticed when someone at the table was quiet and asked about it without self-consciousness, who brought Clara a toy when she cried before anyone else had moved. Clara learned to walk in May and spent the following 2 months navigating the house and yard with the methodical determination of someone conducting a thorough survey of new territory. She had no memory of the shack at the edge of the Mercer Road. She had no memory of the auction in the square or the frozen February morning or the wagon drive up the mountain road. She had only the ranch, the long porch, the barn smell, the dinner table with its permanent ring stain near one edge, the faces that had always been her faces. She was the one who would carry none of the weight of the before. Eleanor felt about this something too complicated to be simply grateful for, but too valuable to call anything other than a gift. The territorial investigation into Victor Hale concluded in August. Marsh sent the letter up with the weekly supply rider. A single page, precise and unsentimental in the way Marsh communicated things that mattered. The investigation had substantiated sufficient concerns to result in Victor's removal from 2 civic appointments he had held for over a decade, and the opening of a formal proceeding regarding certain financial practices that had been apparently a longer-running pattern than anyone had officially acknowledged. He had not been criminally charged, Marsh noted, and probably wouldn't be, given his resources and the nature of territorial justice in 1888, but his position in the valley was effectively finished. He had listed his Iron Ridge holdings for sale in July. The last of his influence in town had been the judgeship, and Prentice had, in the months following the trial, been conspicuously independent of Victor's social circle in ways that people noticed and mentioned. I was not gone from the world. Men like Victor never entirely disappeared, but he was reduced, and the reduction was public, and the valley had moved on without him. Eleanor read the letter at the kitchen table in the morning before anyone else was up. She sat with it for a while. She thought about what she had expected to feel and what she actually felt, which were not the same thing. She had expected relief or satisfaction or some version of the clean vindication that stories promise you. What she actually felt was quieter and less tidy than that. A kind of tired acknowledgement, the feeling of a thing being finished rather than won. Victor Hale's ruin did not give her back the years she'd spent managing his shadow. It did not give Thomas back whatever years he'd spent carrying the weight of his father's particular brand of ownership. It did not undo the shack, or the February morning, or any of the things her children had seen and learned about the world before they should have had to. What it did was end. An ending was enough. She had learned to accept enough. She folded the letter and put it in the tin box with the other documents, and went to start the fire for breakfast. She didn't tell the children about it until that evening, simply and without ceremony, and Caleb nodded and said nothing, and Samuel said good, with a flatness that contained more than the word could hold, and Abigail looked at the table for a moment, and then looked up and said, "I'm glad it's over." Henry asked what they were talking about. "An old problem that's done," Eleanor said. Henry accepted this completely and went back to his biscuit. Gideon, when she told him privately later, was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Does it help?" "Some," she said honestly. "Not the way I thought it would." He nodded. "It usually doesn't." "Does anything?" He looked at the range of mountains visible from the kitchen window. The Blackstone peaks, the high ridge line, the unchanging massive fact of them against the evening sky. "Time," he said, "and something to do with it." She thought that was probably the most accurate answer she'd ever gotten to that question. The summer was the hardest work of Eleanor's life, and also, in a way she didn't have clean language for, the best of it. The ranch ran on all of them. Caleb and Samuel carrying genuine weight in the cattle work, Eleanor managing the household and the kitchen garden, and increasingly the accounts, which she turned out to have a clearer head for than anyone had anticipated, including herself. Gideon worked from early to dark, the way men who have learned to use work as medicine always do, but the character of it had changed. It was no longer work as self-reduction. It was work as provision, which is a different thing entirely, and she could see the difference in him even when he couldn't. There were hard days. There were days when Gideon went silent in a way that was different from his usual quiet, deeper, further away. And on those days Eleanor kept the children from the parts of the house where he'd settled, not with explanation, but with the redirections of a woman who understood that grief did not keep a calendar and required its own room sometimes. There were days when she was short with the children in ways she regretted by evening and went to each of them and said so, which she had always done, because her mother had done it for her, and she believed in the practice even when the pride of it cost something. There were days when Caleb's face went 17 years old in the span of a moment, and she could see Thomas in it so clearly it stopped her breath, and she had to sit with the love and the loss of that simultaneously, which never got clean, only more familiar. But they stayed. All of them stayed. That was the fact at the center of everything else. Autumn arrived and the mountain dressed itself in the colors it always wore for its own leaving. The aspens going gold, the high slopes going rust and amber, the air sharpening to the particular clarity that only came when the warmth had finished, and the cold was still approaching, and for a few weeks the world was exactly the right temperature and exactly the right light. Eleanor had never had a favorite season before. Such seasons had always been primarily logistical, a matter of what they required rather than what they offered. That first autumn at the Cross Ranch was the first time she understood what people meant when they said they loved one. It was on an October evening in that first autumn, with the mountains going purple in the long evening light and the smell of the wood smoke from both chimneys drifting through the still air, that it happened. She was on the porch. Gideon had come out from checking the barn and was standing at the porch rail looking at the view with a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold, the way his coffee always did because he always let himself get distracted by the task before the drink. She was sitting in the chair at the porch end with a book she had not been reading and would not be reading because the mountain was doing what it did at this hour, and it was not possible to look at something that asked less of you. Henry came out and climbed into her lap without asking, which was his standard procedure, and settled himself against her chest with the boneless authority of a 5-year-old claiming what he considered rightfully his. She put her arm around him automatically. After a moment, Henry looked up at Gideon. He studied him with the frank, uncomplicated assessment of a child who had not yet learned that assessment was supposed to be subtle. "Papa," Henry said. Not a question, just a word. Addressed to Gideon with the complete certainty of a child who had been thinking about the right word for a thing and had finally found it. Gideon turned from the porch rail. Eleanor felt the quality of the air change. Gideon looked at Henry for a moment, then down at the coffee cup in his hands. His face did something complicated and private that he normally would have managed more thoroughly if he'd seen it coming. "Yeah," he said, very quietly. Not performing steadiness, actually struggling for it. Henry, satisfied, turned back to the mountain. Eleanor looked at Gideon, and Gideon looked at Eleanor, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing that needed to be said. Because some things have already happened by the time you find the language for them, and the language is just the certificate, not the event. His face was not composed. For once in the time she had known him, Gideon Cross did not have his face composed. She looked at him, and he looked back, and something that had been building for months in the careful daily proximity of two people who had decided to be honest with each other arrived, quietly and without ceremony, in the October light on the porch of the ranch at the foot of the Blackstone Mountains. She reached out her hand. He took it. That was all. Henry didn't notice. The mountain didn't notice. The cattle in the east pasture were indifferent. The barn cats had opinions about nothing but supper. But it happened, and it was real, and neither of them let go. It was Abigail, later, years later, when she was old enough to ask the question properly. Who asked Eleanor when she had known? When she had known that it was real, and not just an arrangement, and not just necessity, and not just gratitude. Eleanor thought about it for a long time, the way she thought about things that deserved careful answers. "October," she said finally. "Your first October here. On the porch. What happened?" Henry called him Papa. Abigail smiled. That same careful, watchful smile she'd had since she was 8 years old, the smile of someone who already knows the answer and is asking to hear it said out loud. "I know," she said. "I was watching from inside." Eleanor laughed. "Of course you were. I just wanted to know if you'd tell me the true thing." Abigail. "You always do," she said. "I just like checking." The years that came after were not a straight line. Nothing worth having ever is. There was a drought. The summer Henry was 7 that took 2 of the cattle and 1 full season's kitchen garden and required every adult in the household to make decisions that had no good version, only less bad ones. There was a winter when Caleb's hands froze badly on a fence repair he'd tried to do alone without telling anyone because he was 15 and had decided that asking for help was something he didn't need to do anymore. And Eleanor spent 3 nights sitting with him while the feeling came back in his fingers, and had the particular argument with him that mothers and teenage sons have had since there were mothers and teenage sons. There was a period, when Samuel was 16, when he and Gideon had a disagreement about the cattle operation that was, on its surface, about cattle and was, at its depth, about something entirely different, about authority and becoming and the complicated negotiation of a boy who was no longer a boy trying to figure out what that meant in a household that had adopted him rather than made him. That one resolved slowly, over months, without a clean conclusion, just a gradual warming back toward the working relationship they'd had before, both of them a little different on the other side of it, and neither of them saying so directly. Rose left for the Valley School at 14 and wrote letters home every week without fail. long ones, full of observations and questions and descriptions of the books she was reading and the people she was meeting. She came back for every holiday. She always came back. The ranch was where she oriented from, even when she was far from it. Abigail stayed the longest of the older children. She worked beside Eleanor through her teenage years with the same focused competence she'd brought to everything since the age of 8, and she asked questions about everything. About the accounts, about the cattle, about the land, about the law, about the trial, and what Eleanor had felt testifying, and why people stayed silent when they knew the truth, and what made some people speak and others not. She wanted to understand how things worked, not just the ranch, everything. She left at 17 for a women's college 3 territories away, with a scholarship she had applied for without telling anyone until it arrived. And when Eleanor found out, she sat down at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands for approximately 30 seconds. Not from grief, but from the particular overwhelming pride that sometimes needed a moment to become manageable. "Did you know she applied?" she asked Gideon that night. "She asked me to look over the essay," he said, with the look of a man who had known he was going to get in trouble for this eventually. "And you didn't tell me." "She asked me not to." Eleanor looked at him. "You kept it a secret for an 8-year-old girl who turned into a 17-year-old woman applying to college." "She's always been hard to say no to," he said. Eleanor thought about Abigail on the witness stand at 8 years old, hands folded, voice even, looking Victor Hale in the eye, and she thought yes. Yes, she had always been hard to say no to. Henry grew up loud and warm and argumentative and deeply, genuinely kind in the way that some people are. See, not as a performance, not as an aspiration, but as an actual built-in orientation toward the world. He ran the east pasture eventually, and then bought a small spread of his own to the north, and came back to the home ranch for dinner every Sunday without fail until he was married, after which he came back with his wife and eventually his children, who arrived in a rapid sequence that kept the dinner table crowded in ways Eleanor found only slightly exhausting and mostly wonderful. Clara grew up on the ranch with no weight of the before to carry, and she carried the lightness of that with a graciousness that Eleanor suspected she never fully understood, because how do you understand the shape of a thing you were saved from? You only know what you have. Clara had the ranch and her family and the mountains she had looked at since she could see, and she thought this was simply the nature of things, which was exactly the point. Gideon did not become a perfect man in the years that followed. He was never going to be a perfect man, and Eleanor had never been looking for one, having spent enough time with the reality of men to understand that the perfect version was a story that served no one. He remained difficult to know at first meeting, closed, weathered, not given to small talk or social ease. He still went silent sometimes, in the way that told her the grief was present and needed space rather than company, and she gave him that space without requiring explanation because she had learned that this was one of the things love actually looked like when it was old enough to know better. He was not, in the conventional sense, an expressive man. He showed the things he felt through the things he did, and after years of watching him do them, Eleanor could read that language as fluently as any other. He fixed things without being asked. He remembered things, small things, the kind that required actual attention to the person they were about. He knew that Caleb needed to be told the reason for a thing before he'd commit to it, and that Samuel needed to be given the opening to find the answer himself, and that Henry needed contact when he was upset and space when he was thinking, and that Abigail needed to be argued with honestly rather than managed, and that Rose needed quiet to be next to instead of noise to be distracted by. He had learned these things not by asking, but by watching, over years, the same way he watched weather and cattle and the mountains' moods, with the patience of someone who understood that paying attention was not a passive act, but the most active one available. And there was the room at the end of the hall. 2 years after the trial, on an April morning that was cold, but not bitterly so, Eleanor came into the kitchen and found Gideon at the table with the painted trunk open in front of him. He was sitting very still, looking at what was inside, and she stopped in the doorway. He heard her and looked up. She waited to take her cue from his face. "Her name was Nora," he said. His voice was even, but held something underneath the evenness that she recognized as the sound of someone saying a name they had not said out loud in a long time. "And our daughter was May. She was 3. He looked back at the trunk. "I've been—" He stopped. "I haven't opened this in 2 years." Eleanor came and sat across from him at the table. She didn't touch the trunk. She didn't fill the silence with consolation. She just sat there with him in it, because she had learned that being present in grief without trying to fix it was harder than fixing it would have been, and also more useful, and she had made herself learn. After a while, he told her about Nora, about how they'd met and what she'd been like and the things she said that he'd never found a way to stop hearing. He told her about May, the specific, unreasonable love of a parent for a small child, the things she had understood that were beyond her age, and the things she hadn't understood that were exactly of it. He told her about the fever and what those weeks had been and how the house had felt after, like a room someone had reached into and removed all the weight-bearing walls from, and how he had spent 3 years learning to navigate the structure without them. He talked for almost an hour. Eleanor listened for all of it. When he was done, the morning had advanced and the kitchen was full of the ordinary sound of the ranch waking up. Henry's feet on the floor above them, Clara's voice from the porch, Caleb's boots crossing the yard toward the barn. "Thank you," Eleanor said. He looked at her with something that was both tired and lighter than it had been an hour ago, in the way of a thing set down rather than abandoned. "You've been patient about that room," he said. "It wasn't mine to rush." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "I want the children to know about them, about Nora and May. Not as a sad thing, just as people who were here." Eleanor nodded. "Whenever you're ready." "I think I'm ready." He closed the trunk carefully. He ran his thumb across the painted flower on the lid. A faded thing, the paint worn at the center from years of exactly this gesture. And then he set his hands flat on his knees and looked up. "All right," he said, simply, like a man coming in from outside and finding the room the right temperature. The years continued and the ranch continued with them. The dinner table that had been quiet for 3 years became one of those tables that people remember, the particular kind that has a gravitational pull, where there is always room for one more and always something on the stove and always at least one argument in progress about something that matters to everyone involved. Voices at a volume that required adjustment from guests not used to it. Laughter that did not wait for permission. Children appearing and then children's children appearing, the table expanding to accommodate them the way good things do, not infinitely, but generously. Harlan Marsh came to dinner twice a year until he was too old to make the drive, and then they went to him. And he sat at his table in the tidy parlor and ate what they brought and argued pleasantly with Samuel about cattle law and told Abigail every time that she should have been an attorney, to which she replied every time that she still might be, and he said he hoped so, and meant it. Victor Hale died at the winter of 1893, alone, in a rooming house in a city 3 territories east of Iron Ridge. Marsh sent the news in his usual spare style, a single paragraph, no editorial comment. Eleanor read it at the kitchen table. She sat with it for a while, as she had sat with his disgrace 5 years before, looking for the clean feeling that stories promised and not finding it, finding instead the same tired acknowledgement she'd found then. He was gone from the world. The weight of him, the shadow of him over the valley and over her children and over everything that had shaped the years before, it was finished. She folded the letter and put it in the tin box and went to start breakfast. She told Gideon that evening. He was quiet for a moment, then, "How do you feel?" "Like it's over," she said. "Just that." He nodded. "That's the right way to feel." On a September evening many years later, the children grown, the grandchildren running the fields below the porch in the long late light, Eleanor and Gideon sat in the chairs at the porch end and watched them. The mountains behind the ranch were going amber at the peaks, the way they always did at this hour in this season, and the air had the particular sharpness of early autumn that Eleanor had loved since that first year. Henry's youngest was chasing one of Rose's grandchildren through the lower field with the total commitment of a 4-year-old who has decided this is the most important thing happening in the world. Clara was calling something from the yard that they couldn't quite make out. Inside there were more voices. Abigail's family had arrived that afternoon, and the house had expanded back into the particular comfortable chaos that it held so well. Gideon had his coffee. It had gone cold. Eleanor watched the children in the field below and thought, as she sometimes did, about the shack at the edge of the Mercer Road, about a February morning with frozen ground and 6 children and $11 in a tobacco tin, about the walk across the square and the man in the wolf pelt coat and 4 words that had changed the axis of every year that followed. She thought about what she had believed family was before: blood, obligation, the people the world assigned you without your input and without recourse. She thought about Thomas and the shape of his limitations, and Victor and the shape of his cruelty, and the long winter that had stripped everything down to the question of what actually held. She had an answer now. She had been building it for years, one day at a time, with her hands and her stubbornness and her willingness to say the true thing, even when the true thing cost her, with the imperfect, complicated love she had for each of these people who had no single origin and no tidy story, but were, without question, hers. Blood had not made this. Choice had made this. The choice made over and over again every morning by every person at this table. To stay, to show up, to do the work, to say the hard thing, to hold on. When holding on was inconvenient and to let go when letting go was what love actually required. She reached over and took Gideon's hand. He looked at her. "Coffee's cold," she said. "It always is," he said. She smiled. So did he. The full version of it. The one she had worked for and waited for and eventually stopped waiting for and then received anyway. The way the best things always came. Without announcement, in the middle of an ordinary moment when she had forgotten to look. Below them, Henry's youngest tripped in the long grass and went down with a squeal and came up immediately, arms out, already running again. The mountains held their color against the darkening sky. The house behind them was full of noise and people and the smell of whatever Clara had started on the stove. And Eleanor Cross sat in the chair she had sat in for 30 years, on the porch of the home that had not been hers until it was, beside the man who had chosen her before he knew her, and she understood, not for the first time but more fully than before, in the way understanding deepens over decades rather than arriving all at once, that the family you choose and the family that chooses you back is not a lesser thing than the one you were born to. It is the braver thing. It is the thing that requires you to mean it every day, without the safety net of blood or obligation to hold you there when meaning it gets hard. It is the thing worth building. And on the coldest day of her life, when the whole world stood silent and everything she had was almost taken, one lonely man in a wolf pelt coat had made a choice. She had spent 30 years making it back,